So this is going to be a very casual session and clearly unprofessional as well, given this start. When Ashoka asked me if I would do this, of course I jumped at the opportunity. But in thinking about it, I would probably now have labeled this a parent's guide to the power of disability, or an ally's guide to the power of disability, or an accomplice's guide to the power of disability. I'm the parent of a young woman with a disability, and before she was born, her name is Liz. Before she was born, I had virtually no interest in people with disabilities. I'm a community organizer, had been all my life, and never saw the challenges and issues faced by people with disabilities as meriting, and I hate to use that word, but that's how arrogant I was, as meriting my time and attention. And so Liz's birth plunged me into a world that has been my home for the last 40 years. She's in her 40s now. She describes herself as a poet, as an artist, and as someone who has Down syndrome. She defines Down syndrome as being a condition that sometimes takes her a little longer to think about things. She also says her Down syndrome is rad. And if I was to interpret how she looks at her disability, it would be both the real deal and no big deal. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. My appreciation for the power of disabilities has slowly emerged over the last 40 years. I think it's a culture as great and powerful as any culture out there. And it is a culture that has been completely overlooked. In my opinion, people with disabilities have been erased from history in either three ways, which I'd like to describe, and I'd like to tell you some stories and show you some pictures of people. It's either been erased by ignoring the person with the disability and their contribution, or by separating the person's disability from their contribution. In other words, the focus is only on their contribution, or the credit for the contribution has been given to someone else. This, despite the fact that people with disabilities are authoritative sources on art, every conceivable kind of art. I'm going to tell you some stories of some people who, one woman in particular, is the most famous artist in the world right now. Few people know of her disability. They are authoritative sources on democracy, on freedom, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. I'm going to tell you the story of someone who is instrumental in the birth of democracy, whose disability is ignored. They are experts at love, on comedy, on invention and ingenuity and the like. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about, is the power of disability. I think there are 5 disability advantages. The power of majority. 1 in 7 individuals worldwide has a disability. That's 1.2 billion people. That comprises the largest minority group on the planet. That's the population of China, and almost 4 times the population of North America. 1 in 7. Another 3 in 7, this is a conservative calculation, are their parents, brothers, sisters, uncles, aunts, their friends, people who provide professional services, and their supporters. That means 4 in 7 people in the world have a connection to the disability. That's a potent majority. That's an audience, a base, a market that's pretty hard to ignore. And it's just waiting to be mobilized. Here's one stat I thought you might be interested in. It represents $8 trillion in annual disposable income. The much sought after teen market in North America is relatively small compared to that. It represents $220 billion, untapped market. It's the power of inclusivity, the second power. The disability movement intersects with every gender, race, ethnicity, color, creed, class, sexual orientation, income level, health condition, living arrangement, and age group. I think it predisposes people in the disability world to understand difference as a natural fact of life, to be welcomed and celebrated, not cured or circumscribed or curtailed. The power of ingenuity, as one friend of mine said, you don't have to be disabled to be innovative or inventive, but it sure helps. There's no group in history with more consistent experience at making their mark, despite the deck being stacked against them, than people with disabilities. Every day in most of the world, people with disabilities wake up to a world that's not designed for them. They are constantly having to invent themselves out of adverse circumstances. They are the original hackers. Many of the innovations we take for granted were solutions to challenges they faced that went on to benefit the wider population. If there's any bicycling fans out there, the bicycle was invented by a man with a disability in the 1500s. The typewriter, curb cuts. Those are two really quick examples. There's nothing like a dash of disability to increase your ingenuity. The fourth power is the power of authenticity. Our culture is inexhaustible in its capacity to ignore our interdependence, to ignore our reliance on each other. It promotes the myths of individualism, of independence, of invincibility. Problems the culture suggests, I realize I'm simplifying this to some extent, but the problems are simply sanitized, they're simplified, they're easily resolved if only we had the right attitude or if we found the right savior. But I think the world is rejecting that view. We want hope that is qualified by authenticity, and we're looking for stories that we can relate to. The disability movement offers a refreshing alternative to that lone hero, usually a man, overcoming overwhelming odds. It reminds us that justice emerges from the bottom up, as we're seeing now during the pandemic, and not from the top down. Always justice emerges in the company of so-called ordinary people who disrupt the status quo in big and small ways. And finally, the fifth power of disability I would submit is that it's a unifying force in the world. Tumultuous times we're living in, increasingly fractured and polarized. People want to know they're not alone, that they can be part of something bigger than themselves. Given the stats I told you earlier, the power of the disability community is to bridge our divides and bring us together. It's the world's most common condition. It encompasses diversity, exudes ingenuity, authenticity, and it's in the majority. I think that's an unrivaled combination and force for change. I want to share some stories with you now, but before that, I want to tell you about three stages in my relationship with my daughter Liz. When she was born with Down syndrome, I searched for a couple of years for a cure. At the time, Prevention magazine was a mainstay in our house, and I found an article that said that there was a megavitamin cure for Down syndrome. I pursued this doctor, through about 5 locations, 3 in North America and another couple in Europe. This was pre-internet days, so I was writing letters, trying to search for him. The search ended when I realized that Liz didn't need to be cured, that there are no miracle cures, and that this doctor was, in fact, what I guess we call a quack. I then shifted, and what I did was I tried to make my daughter fit in. And so my goal was conformity. It's kind of a double-sided approach. I went out of my way to make sure she had the designer clothes that everybody else did. I never did that for my other children. But for Liz, I wanted her to fit in. And I also tried to curtail her extravagance, her ebullience, her enthusiasm, because again, I wanted her to fit in. So I left that stage of my parenting with Liz when I saw the confidence with which she stood in front of a stage and did spoken word poetry, in which she cued in a jazz musician to accompany her, in which she, without any preparation, held a room in the palm of her hand for about 5 minutes as she summarized the proceedings of a 3-day conference. Finally, I accepted Liz for who she is and always has been, and recognized that my journey through cure and conformity to an appreciation not only of her confidence, but to the fact that there is a powerful disability culture that's embodied with artistry, that's embodied with pride, that's embodied with fierceness, and frankly, right now, a lot of anger. So that's my story. Now I'm going to try something I practiced in the practice room here. Is I'm going to share my screen with you. Just a little plug for my book, The Power of Disability, 10 Lessons for Surviving, Thriving, and Changing the World. Took me 8 months, but I finally managed to convince Michael J. Fox, arguably one of the most famous, recognized people with disability, certainly in North America, if not elsewhere. So he gave me a really nice, juicy quote for the book that I put on the cover. Okay, I see what I have to do here. This is a photograph of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, one of the more celebrated and appreciated American presidents. This is one of the very few, literally very few photographs of him in a wheelchair. I think generally now people know that he had a disability that required him to use a wheelchair most of the time. But when he was in office, he did everything possible to hide his disability. They erected screens and barriers along the way to the podium, and he would wheel close to where those screens were, and then have 2 aides assist him, and he would walk steadily to the podium and speak there. He bade the media from taking any pictures of him using a wheelchair. He had a team of people who protected him from him from being seen as an individual with disability, because he saw that it would reduce his political chances. It is only in recent times that there's been an acknowledgement of that, and if you go to the FDR Museum, you will actually see a beautiful statue of him with his disability. So that's an example of somebody whose contributions, the New Deal, America entering the Second World War, all of his achievements occurred by purging the disability from the person's contribution. Here's somebody I don't expect you to recognize, but this man is John Milton, and he wrote a number of books on freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Extraordinary for his time. He wrote them at night. He wrote them by candlelight, and he became blind. He did write a poem called On Blindness, a number of very famous lines, one of them which is, "They also serve who only stand and wait." Milton's disability was separated from his contributions and from his contribution to the birth of democracy. Harriet Tubman, I understand that her face, her image is to be on the front of the American $20 bill, likely sometime this year or early next year. She was known as Moses to African Americans for freeing people who were enslaved and bringing them via the Underground Railway to Canada. She was also an early suffragette. She lived to a ripe old age, into her 90s. We're not 100% sure. They're not 100% sure how old she was, because the date of her birth is not precise. But she, at the age of 12, was hit over the head by a steel bar by a slave owner, and had to deal with a disability for the rest of her life. It included severe epileptic seizures. Essentially, it was a massive brain injury. In most of the historical accounts of Harriet Tubman, there is no reference to her disability. If there is a reference to a person with a disability, it's usually for a couple of reasons. One, for pity, to exemplify tragedy, or two, for inspiration, to overcoming the odds. So this is a picture of Beethoven. I chose this one because it had the tagline, "Beethoven in Isolation." People talk about his beautiful music pouring out of him after he became deaf, as a sign of overcoming adversity, of a sign of great tragedy for him, as opposed to appreciating a remarkable talent with heightened sensitivity in his other senses. You'll all recognize this gentleman, the great scientist. This is the other side of the disability equation, that people with disabilities overcome significant handicaps to go on to have achievements, almost super achievements, beyond what most of the world can accomplish. And that's the other place that people with disabilities are often situated, as our sources of inspiration, doing something extraordinary that no one can accomplish. This woman here, Stella Young, an Australian, who had a passion for beautifully designed high heel shoes, has a beautiful TED talk called I'm Not Your Inspiration. In fact, she calls this sort of pity or inspiration put up on a pedestal attitude toward people with disabilities as inspiration porn. So that's an example of where the disability movement is now. They want to be recognized not only for being a person with a disability, or in the emerging language of the day, a disabled person. So that nomenclature, in my research for the book and the people I'm surrounded by nowadays, is shifted from person with a disability, person first language, to more and more of the disability community, particularly the emerging, the younger disability community, saying, I'm going to put my disability first. Disability, disabled person, disability pride, and Stella Young is one of the bright lights, foremost teachers in that regard. Here's a picture of someone who's often associated with disability. It's the guy on the right. It's Alexander Graham Bell. People, of course, acknowledge his invention of the telephone. And they often will comment that he invented that telephone so that he could communicate in some way with his mother, who was deaf, and his wife, who's seen here in this photograph with their two daughters, who was also deaf. What people don't realize is that Alexander Graham Bell is viewed by members of the deaf community as attempting to purge their culture, as to purge a perfectly legitimate way of communicating sign language. Bell's method of teaching people with disabilities, he often said that that's who he was first and foremost, an educator of people with disabilities, people who are deaf, was all focused on oral, on lip reading. And he furthermore was a eugenicist. He believed that deaf people should not intermarry because that would produce more deaf children. I won't go into a lot of details, but I simply want to say that he's often counted as a contributor to the disability movement when people who are deaf would argue that they're still trying to undo the kind of mindset that he created around people with deaf and the damage he did to a perfectly legitimate way of communicating and to a perfectly legitimate culture. Incidentally, if you see yourself as a member of deaf culture, you use capital D. If you describe the condition you have, you will use the non-capital, just small d. This woman, Yayoi Kusama, is in her 90s. She fled Tokyo when she was a teenager, went to New York. New York was part of the New York avant-garde art scene. She was famous as any of the other artists of that time. But the obsessional images and hallucinations that she had experienced since she was a child grew in intensity. And so she fled New York back to Tokyo and checked herself into a psychiatric hospital in the 70s, where she actually still lives. Every day she leaves that institution, walks across the street to her studio and makes art, paintings, sculptures. She writes poetry, she writes books. Her name is Yayoi Kusama, Yayoi Kusama, Kusama. One of her art installations is called the Infinity Room. when it was last in New York and in Toronto at the Art Gallery of Ontario, people lined up for blocks to experience her Infinity Room. I'm going to show you a picture of the Infinity Room if none of you have ever been in there. You enter what seems like a small closet. It's mirrored, and there are these glowing orbs all over the place. She has an interest in helping us appreciate how small we really are. And so she, I suppose, wants us to be humble, to be humbled by the installation, but also to appreciate our place in the majesty of the universe. Go back to her photograph here. She calls herself the priestess of polka dots. She paints polka dots on everything. She said this was her way to stay in touch with reality. She puts them only on her dresses. You'll see her wheelchair. She currently uses the wheelchair is emblazoned with polka dots, and many of her most famous paintings, which sell in the millions of dollars now, are emblazoned with polka dots as well. If you judge by museum attendance and art gallery attendance now, she is the most famous artist in the world who lives with a psychiatric illness. This woman, Agnes Richer, the woman who's produced this jacket, also lived in a psychiatric institution in the late 1800s. She was forcibly placed there when she was in her 50s. And so she was an incredible seamstress. When people look at her artwork today, they're amazed at what she was able to produce in that sterile environment. This essentially is a variation of a straitjacket, and it's emblazoned with all kinds of script, most of which people have not been able to discern. But I'm just trying to find some of the things. One of the lines that people were able to read here was, "I wish to read." And another line that was sewn into her jacket was, "I plunge headlong into disaster." People have written books about her. This jacket is now on display at a major museum in Heidelberg. It's part of a collection of 6,000 pieces of artwork that were rescued by a psychiatrist in the early 1920s from psychiatric institutions. So people make meaning of their life. They make art in every conceivable circumstance. This young man, Aaron Philp, is the first trans person of color with a disability to sign a major modeling contract. I invite you to Google him and see his delightful enthusiasm, confidence, and out there spirit. His cover spreads now for fashion magazines are quite well known, and he is treating fashion as his platform or vehicle to express his pride in who he is. This piece of sculpture was made by a woman who spent the first 50 years of her life in an institution because she had Down syndrome, just like my daughter. She was a twin, and her twin sister had moved from their home in Ohio to California. It's quite a story. She woke up one day, or it was actually during a yoga session she was having, and felt this fierce longing for her sister, tracked her down, rescued her from the institution she still lived in, brought her home to California, enrolled her in art classes, and for another 10, 15 years of her life, all she did was create these sculptures, which are now in some of the most prestigious art collections in the world, and she is recognized as a genuine creative innovator in the art world. There are movies made about her, and her name is Judith Scott. I'm going to show you a picture of her right now. This is her hugging one of her sculptures. Sadly, she died a few years ago, so she's no longer with us. But her legend, her legendary art, and her legend lives on. The power of disability. You recognize this young woman. She identifies as a person which she calls on the spectrum. The word Asperger's is often used in association with people with autism. Most people in the autism community do not use Asperger's anymore because he's identified with the eugenics policies of the Nazis. You're more likely to have people describe themselves as being on the spectrum or being part of the neurodiverse community. They actually make fun of us neurotypical people. There's a profound sense of humor in that community, but you'll recognize Greta Thunberg for the profound influence that she is having on the world. I'm going to end my presentations, and I'm really not sure how we can interact here by referencing Judith Heumann. I don't think this likeness on Time magazine does her justice, but she was chosen by Time magazine as one of the most 100 influential women of the last 100 years. Judith is also the major organizer of the largest occupation of an American government building ever in 1977. That's why the year 1977 is on this cover. I hope you can see it. She attended a camp in New York State with a number of other disabled people who went on to make disability rights history. That sit-in that Judith Heumann was part of, that was a major force in, led to the Americans with Disability Act. That camp and those people and their contributions and that sit-in is now a major documentary on Netflix called Crip Camp. It's one of the first documentaries that the Obamas financed, and I have to tell you that yesterday it was nominated on the short list for Best Documentary for the upcoming Academy Awards. If you haven't heard of Judy Heumann, you are certainly going to hear more about her role in the occupation and her role since. She's worked for the World Bank. She's turned the Ford Foundation's policy with regard to disability inclusion upside down. She's a force for change. And last year, her book came out, the Time Magazine Acknowledgement and Crip Camp, and I interviewed her for a podcast I do, and I said, can it get any better than that? And she said, absolutely. The thing she's most proud of last year is the interview she did with Trevor Noah. So you can look that up if you want. So, folks, I hope this is useful. I can't tell if you're there or not, as I've mentioned. This is kind of a unique situation for me because I rely on the visual energy or the personal energy of people in a room. I want to leave you with two things. One, take 45 minutes and see the film Crip Camp. And two, if you're really interested in where the disability movement is going, pay attention to the concept of disability justice. In my country, Canada, we have this expression because many people in our country are fanatics about hockey, as they say, a most talented hockey player knows where the puck is going to go. Well, where the disability movement is going is in the direction, I believe, of disability justice. This is a blend. I don't know if you can see it over my shoulder. I have a T-shirt from the group in California that has written a lot about it, called Access is Love. And so this is a blend of justice and love. That there is no justice without love, and there is no love without justice. It's deeper than that. San Francisco is a hotbed of thinking and action around disability justice. A woman there by the name of Mia Mingus, another woman by the name of Alice Wong, both of whom I profiled in my book. Up here in Vancouver, young man by the name of Carmen Papalia. There are centers of disability justice around the world. So, for me, the power of disability, and not to put too fine a point on it, is the power to guide the world through this pandemic in the direction of increasing equality and increasing justice, and bringing us together in order to do so. I hope this has been interesting in some ways. If you're at all interested in my book, it's called The Power of Disability. And I write a weekly blog as well called The Power of Disability, which you can find on my website, al@mansky.com. I'd appreciate you subscribing. What I do is every week I choose 4 people with disabilities who have made their mark in society. You will be surprised at how many of these people you know and how little you knew about their disability. And I would challenge you to imagine a world without their contributions. And that is ultimately the point, isn't it? That everyone's presence and contribution is valuable, is part of creating the world we want. So I want to thank you. If you've got a question that you can type in the chat box, I'm happy to answer it. I think we have another 10 minutes or so, or we can just close this down. So I'll wait. I can see the chat box here, so send some questions through if there's anything specifically that I've said that you'd like to talk about. I can tell that there are 18 viewers on this platform. It tells me that. So I'd appreciate a comment or a question, a challenge. I'm going to feel like an auctioneer here and say, are there any further questions? Going? Any further questions? Going? Okay, well, I bid you a good day. Thanks for this opportunity. I hope I've tickled your curiosity and that you'll investigate the power of disability, or amplify the power of disability, or learn, as I'm learning, to be a better ally of people with disabilities as they make their mark on the world. So again, I'm signing off, al@mansky. My book is called The Power of Disability, 10 Lessons for Surviving, Thriving, and Changing the World. Thanks for your attention. Good day.